Hello everyone and welcome to a new series of counterpoint style conversations, counterpoint style conversations here on your Arlington Dollar. I'm James Milan and I am here in the studio with Annie LaCourt and Dean Carman. Annie is a former Board of Selectmen, or a former Selectman, excuse me, and currently she is serving on Vision 2020's Standing Committee. And Dean is, although from my perspective, still a young man. He has logged 11 years now on Arlington's Finance Committee. Welcome to you both, and thanks for coming and being here today for the conversation.
Thank you.
What we would like to do today is take a topic that is on everybody's mind, and that is the situation with school enrollment and the anticipated increases there. And use that to look at several different aspects of the way that government functions and the way that money moves here in Arlington. As you know, that is the main focus for your Arlington Dollar. So specifically, we're going to want to look at what the financial impact is likely to be on householders and for the town in general, how decisions are going to be made, or how decisions are made generally, and then perhaps most importantly of all, how citizens can and should get involved and participate in this process. So to begin with, I would love to just throw it out to you both to offer your own perspectives. What are we talking about here with the school enrollment situation? I've heard everything from it's a somewhat of a challenge to it's a crisis. What are your perspectives? Annie, why don't we start with you?
I think that what's happening with school enrollment in Arlington is it's a challenge. It's a challenge in several different ways. It's a long-term challenge that we're going to have to make big adjustments to plans around. And it is something that we should take a positive attitude towards because in essence, it's because we've been so successful over the last 10 years in improving our schools and making our town an attractive place to live. What we're seeing is a growth in the number of people who want to live here and who want to raise their kids here and have them in our excellent schools.
And Dean?
Well, I would take a slightly different, sort of little more micro view of it, which is, I mean, Annie's right in what she's saying, but it also has a personal aspect that depending on who you are, it could be a non-issue, a challenge, or a crisis. If you're an East Arlington parent of a Hardy or Thompson student, you're looking at this as a crisis. You're saying the school is, in the case of the Thompson, overcapacity, it's going to get even worse. Something has to be done, something has to be done immediately. If you're a parent over in one of the other 5 schools, you're looking at this as a challenge. Your school's on edge. It's about to, could tip over, but it might not, and you're focused long-term on the middle school and the high school. And I think if you're, a longer-term resident who doesn't have kids in the system or no connection to the public school system, in some ways it's a non-issue. It's more of a financial issue. You're looking and saying, my property taxes are this. How much is it going to cost to solve this problem that's deep, that's, passionate for, that other people are passionate about?
Okay, so somewhat it depends on one's perspective and position, as so many things do. All right, let's actually dive into what the, giving an idea. I'm sure many in our audience are already generally familiar with what's going on here, but let's get a better idea of what it is that we are dealing with when we talk about the school enrollment crisis challenge, whatever it is. Okay. So I know you guys have brought some material along with you, and feel free to refer to that as you kind of walk us through what is going on.
What we're thinking of as in the enrollment crisis is strong growth in the elementary school population that began a few years ago and is working its way up to the Addison, and it's uneven growth. So Dean had prepared this great spreadsheet that we're looking at that shows how this growth curve is on its way up and jumping up in big chunks in the Hardy and Thompson districts. But those kinds of surges have already come through at other elementary schools, the Brackett and the Bishop, and Dallin is the school that we're looking here as the example, and those schools are kind of leveling out. Folks may remember that we went through a redistricting a few years ago, and really that redistricting, at that point, we were all concentrated on population growth in the Brackett school, the Dallin school, the Bishop school, and how were we going to shift those populations to even things out and guarantee the quality of the experience for all our elementary students. So I don't know, Dean, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the charts, I think one of the challenges residents have, or people who aren't involved in the day-to-day operation of town government, is to hear a lot of these macro numbers thrown around, like the school's increased by 1,000 students, or 4,000 or 5,000, 3,000, 5,000. I think that's very difficult for people to get their arms around. The numbers are just too big, and they can't personalize it. So what we tried to do on this spreadsheet is take two examples, the Hardy and the Dallin. The Hardy representing East Arlington, the Hardy and the Thompson, and the Dallin representing the other 5 schools. And what you can clearly see, if you go back to 2010, is a school that had grade cohorts coming through which required 2 or 3 classrooms. You'd have anywhere from, let's say, 40 to 60, maybe a little more children coming through the Hardy, so you might need 2 teachers for that grade, or you might need 3 teachers for that grade. What we're seeing, keeping with the Hardy example, is each cohort coming through is now larger. So they tipped the 2 classroom cohorts aren't coming in. We started seeing 3 classroom cohorts. And then the last 2 years at the Hardy, we've seen 4 classroom cohorts. So when you look at the revised McKibben projections, if you were to assume that 4 cohort trend in the Hardy is to continue, you will now have 4 cohorts eventually in every single grade. So you will have gone from 2010, where you needed 15 classrooms at the Hardy, to 2020, 2021, where you're going to need 24 classrooms.
Okay,
so a
and
net pickup of 9 rooms.
Thank you for that. I just want to interject, though, that you did make reference to something that you called the revised McKibben projections, and
Yes.
let's just, if you can just clarify, what is that? What are we talking about?
So what happened was the town hired a company that's run by a man named Jerome McKibben to perform a projection of enrollment in Arlington, what he thinks it's going to be over the next 10 years. So he worked on it in the spring, he worked on it in the summer, he issued it in the fall.
Okay.
And we had these projection numbers. What happened was, if you look at the numbers and you compare it to the numbers he projected for 2015-16, the current year we're in, if you compare actual to projection, what you see is that there was a large miss. And he missed significantly in the kindergarten and first grade.
He missed on the lower end? Or?
He projected more students
Okay.
showing up. He projected a lot more students were going to show up, I think primarily in the bracket in Stratton. So he did very well in predicting the enrollment of the other 5 schools, but he missed significantly in those 2 schools. And so the school went through a process of having him revise the projections and saying, okay, we need these revised McKibben projections to understand better what we think, and we got the revised McKibben projection.
Okay. So excuse the digression, and let's go ahead and get back to the analysis of the situation
Yes.
now.
Essentially, I think what we're saying is that we have this immediate problem in a couple of elementary schools. We've got a bunch of different ways we've got to make decisions about space, but we're also looking downstream at what happens when those kids get to the junior high school. And so on tab 2, we have a sort of an analysis of what we think the implications of that cohort coming through are going to be for the Ottoson about 5 years from now. And we see some drop off between the elementary population. You can't just say all those kindergartners are going to show up in 6th grade. We see about a 10% drop off, Dean. Statistically, when kids get to that point, the Ottoson was built for 1,000 or 1,100 students, and I think by 2020 we're talking about 1,300 students in the school.
And we'll continue probably to about 1,400 or 1,500 after that.
So that also has to be dealt with, and obviously that also has implications for the new high school that we're talking about building. So this is the sort of big picture of what's going on and all the issues that are being grappled with. So there's 2 streams to the challenge, if you want to use that word. One is, where are we going to put all these kids? What kind of space and what kind of capital investment do we need to make? And then there's a second stream, which is, how are we paying for the teachers and the resources that need to be in each of these classrooms? If you go back and you look at Hardy, if you've had cohorts of kids at grade level, say your first grade has got 3 classrooms and your second grade has got 2 classrooms, well, you need 3 first grade teachers and 2 second grade teachers. But if now you're going to have 4 classes at each of those grade levels, now we need 4 teachers at each of those grade levels. How are we going to pay for those additional resources and all the attendant resources that go with them? Gym teachers, art teachers, curriculum materials, so on and so forth, and the other pressures that are on the school at the same time.
Basically, what you're describing is that we've got a big rat that's going to be moving through the snake, so to speak.
Yep.
And while that will not be perhaps
Right.
as big as it currently is, if you look at all the kindergartens, by the
Right.
time they get to sixth grade. And by the way, do we have any sense of where are these kids going between the end of elementary school and the beginning of middle school? And do we keep track of what's happening?
The district has a very good understanding of where the kids go, because they know if you're still living in the town, they know if you're in the public schools or you're pursuing other educational opportunities. And so when you look at the attrition to the middle school, or you look at the attrition through people's entire education experience, the three big drop-offs are sixth grade, seventh grade, and ninth grade. And if you think about it, if you just backed up, if you start at the top with the ninth grade, you'd normally assume that people go to private schools or they're going to Minuteman, right? So you take Arlington Catholic, BB&N, and Minuteman School as the three most local places, and everybody knows someone that's gone to those schools, so it makes sense that the drop-off occurred there. Seventh grade, again, if I was just to point to a BB&N or a Belmont Hill, they start their programs in seventh grade and they move 7 to 12, so you see a drop-off of kids going to private schools there. And then I think sixth grade is, though I don't have this on a statistical or an actual analytic basis, I think you have some children that are moving to other educational opportunities, and then I think you have parents who have, through jobs or things like that, had sort of been moved away from Arlington before then, but they really wanted their kids to finish at the elementary school, and they felt, look, this is a good time to make a break from Arlington because the kid's moving from fifth grade to sixth grade, so I can move there. So I think there are various reasons why people leave the Arlington Public Schools at those times.
Okay, so to summarize, we have a situation in which there is a current need in at least 2 schools that is pressing, and then we can anticipate that there are going to be future dramatic needs and changes
At the middle school.
in place. Yeah. So I'd like now to go back and start talking about those 3 aspects that I mentioned at the outset. Specifically, so what are the financial impacts likely to be for Arlingtonians coming out of this? How soon are they likely to hit? What kinds of impact are, what level of impact are we talking about? Just if you can give us, obviously there are no firm answers to these things, we understand,
Right.
but you guys are your best informed guesses for around those issues right now.
I think one of the challenges when you look at this, the future cost of things, is you have to start, in my opinion, by looking backwards, where we've been and where we are now. And the reason I think that's an important thing is so let me stipulate for a second. I'm not trying to argue against the quality or effectiveness of government services. I think Annie and I will both agree that the town delivers
absolutely.
great services and there's nothing wrong. I'm not going to argue there's waste and inefficiency. But we have to look at the cost. And so over the last decade, property taxes in this town have increased significantly, right? So we had an override in 2004, 5, or 6, I forget exactly, 2006. We had an override in 2011. We passed the Community Preservation Act last year. We had a debt exclusion for elementary schools before that. So, all of those came on top of the normal 2.5% growth each year in your property taxes. So if you average it out over a decade, Arlington's property taxes have gone up about 4 to 5% every year. And so everybody realizes that that's greater than wage growth, right? People's wages aren't growing at that rate. So you have a situation where, let's say, 10, 15 years ago, people were paying 5% of their gross pay for property taxes, and now it's probably closer to 7.5% of people's gross pay for property taxes. Now, when we look into the future, our challenge, when we try to address this, is not only are we going to continue to see the 2.5% annual growth afforded to us under Proposition 2.5, but we're looking at the potential of overrides. So we could have an override for, to fund Arlington High School, override to fund Minuteman Vocational. We could probably going to have an operating override for just the general government, and then you have to figure out a way to deal with the Thompson, the Hardy, and the Audison. So right away, I don't think there's any doubt in people's mind that there is going to be significant growth in property taxes moving forward. So that pattern of 5% growth is likely to continue based on all of these things. And there tends to be a lot of value judgment on that. How does that work? Is it affordable? And I think that in some ways charts people's decision making on how we address this, right? So if we went with the gold standard for everything, if we got the best, you put up the best edition possible at Thompson and Hardy, and took back the Gibbs, and we opened it up brand new and shiny, and we built the most expensive Arlington High we could, and the most expensive Minuteman we could, but we added all this money to the school system, just really drastic stuff, right? Property taxes could go up 50 to 70% at that point, which I don't think anyone would do that, right? So now you got to say, okay, well, we don't want to do that. How are we going to work through the challenges at a different level. And I think a lot of times for people's financial interest, I think that's the big thing a lot of people talk about. And just as I close out the point, I think that also leads to a sort of a disagreement within the community. If you're a young parent, you have school-age children, and people are sitting there and saying, hey, let's do all this stuff and increase property taxes, 30 to 50%. They say that's great. If you're a 30-year resident of this town and you're struggling financially and the taxes are already too high for you, you might not feel the same way about that. And so I think that's really one of the big challenges we have as we move forward. How do you balance both the new residents and the older residents who in some ways have completely different views of affordability?
And Annie, let me just ask you, actually, you're welcome to build on this in whatever way you want, but let me ask you, what might you say to, as Dean was just pointing out, there are 30-year residents of Arlington and beyond for whom perhaps the benefits of everything, all the changes we're talking about are not quite palpable, and yet the impact is going to be severe as far as they're concerned. What would you say to them?
So I would start by framing the issue a little bit differently than the way that Dean has just framed the issue, which is, and we tend to frame the issue the way that Dean's talking about it. How much do we have to raise our taxes? What's it going to cost us? And therefore the discussion comes down to how much of a rise in my taxes can I tolerate? And so we're concentrated over here on how much money, but we're not concentrated on what are the services that's going to buy, and what are the implications of not providing those services. And so the first discussion I want to have is, what do the schools need and why? And what do they really need? And what are our choices about what we're prioritizing in that box, okay? So, for example, if you're talking about the need to provide teachers in classrooms for the students who are coming through as part of this increased enrollment, right now our standard is 20 to 25 kids in a classroom. If we don't provide the money, those classroom sizes are going to increase and the quality of that education is going to deteriorate. Right now the schools are already struggling. This enrollment growth period started 2 years ago, and so they've been seeing more kids in classrooms. They've been hiring teachers to keep the size of the classrooms reasonable, the number of kids in a classroom, and at the same time they've been having to cut everything else around the edges. So we're not buying new curriculum materials, we're not expanding social services that the schools need to provide, so on and so forth. On the Arlington Education Foundation, for example, we're seeing requests from teachers for mini grants to provide resources to deal with developmental problems and social and emotional growth for their students. There's a huge amount of pressure on these kids, and we don't have the resources to support them in the level of stress that they're experiencing as they try to meet these new academic standards. So we're seeing this trend, and they're coming to us for the money because the school system is saying the best we can do is keep your class size to 25. We can't help you around the edges with all the other things that you might need to provide a 21st century education. So I think of education as an investment that the community makes in the community's future, okay? We always talk about this, and it's worth bringing it back up, that the value of your property is affected by the quality of the schools, because it's about how much do people want to move here, and therefore what are they willing to pay for a home that they might want to buy in Arlington. And then there's competition between services, and schools are one of the few services that we absolutely have to provide. At some point, the schools are going to simply to provide the mandated services for these students. Those budgets are going to have to increase, and that money is going to have to come from somewhere. And if it doesn't come from an increase in our taxes above the 2.5%, it's going to come from other services in the town. So we have to look at this holistically, both for the families who see this as a crisis and for the other residents of the town. Holistically, what's the set of services that we need to provide, and how are we going to pay for that set of services, and how are we going to not just balance the increase in your taxes against the services you're getting, but the various services provided, how do we strike the right balance of what everybody in town needs? One way to solve, for example, the school enrollment problem by providing the schools with more operating funds is to cut some other service. We could stop providing your trash collection for free. We could start charging for trash collection. that's another way to raise the funds that are needed. So
So are you arguing for a public conversation in which all of this is on the table, basically, in order to be able to say, present to Arlingtonians, okay, here are the implications, not just within the school system, but beyond that?
Yeah,
If you're, if you're chafing at the rise in your property costs at 5%
right.
or property tax
So
costs?
essentially I would say there was a moment that crystallized this conversation for me at town meeting this year. And that was the moment when the Finance Committee stood up and proudly declared that they were changing what had been the agreed upon planning number for increases in operating costs from 3.5% to 3%. And that this was going to stretch out the amount of time before we had to have that public conversation again and look at another operating override. And the question that I raised was, whoa, wait a minute. Where's the plan that goes with that 3% that shows us what services we're going to be able to continue to provide, the quality of those services, how you're saving that money, how you arrived at this moment, and what choices do the residents have about whether or not that's the package of services they actually want, and whether or not they're willing to pay more to get more, or whether or not their needs are still met. Mm-hmm. And that was before this whole question of the impacts of enrollment on the schools arose this year. And right now, everybody's concentrated on the question about space. Where are we going to put all these kids? But coming right behind that is this question of what does it cost to educate all of these kids? And how does that impact the whole package of services the town provides to all of our citizens?
Okay. And as a fellow town meeting member, Dean, I know you were present at for the same proceedings Annie was just referring to.
Well, and I voted on decreasing the rate of growth in the budget, so we have really different views on this. I think the challenge, to put a different perspective on the schools, is and this is sort of I'm not speaking for the Finance Committee, but I think it's a Finance Committee member. And again, I like to look at history and moving forward. Is you go back in Arlington 30 years ago, this was a community where people who were moving here because they felt that Arlington was a better alternative to a community like Medford, Waltham, Malden. It was sort of a step up, right? And that was sort of the folks we had, and we had a school system that reflected that, and we were sort of sandwiched in the middle. What's happened over the last 15 years, really a lot over the last 5 years, is Arlington has transitioned quickly. I would call it gentrification. I don't think a selectman would call it that because they think of it as a pejorative, but it's changed rapidly to a community where the people who are moving into town weren't looking at Medford, Waltham, and Malden. They were looking at Belmont, Arlington, and Lexington. And so the school committee, who's a very aspirational group, is now benchmarking themselves and their services against Belmont, Arlington, and Winchester, Lexington, and Belmont. And they're saying, look, we need to bring our school system on par with them, because the people who are coming into our schools and are looking, are getting educated here, we're looking at those places for homes, and they ended up here. So at the last 2 long-range planning committee meetings ago, the school committee said, look, in addition to the 3.25% growth we get for general ed, the 7% growth we get for special ed, the town taking care of our health insurance, we want not just to stick with we want $3.7 million of additional money for our budget next year, which is a really big increase. And in that was money to maintain class size, to deal with the enrollment growth. There was money to provide state-mandated services, and then there was money to be aspirational and become Belmont, Lexington, and Winchester. And that's sort of a challenge that I think gets debated in town, which is what is our place in all of this? We're clearly never going to go back to being the step up from Waltham, Malden, Medford. We're definitely on a trajectory. If you look at development in town and people coming in, we are going to be on par at some point with the 3 communities I keep mentioning, right? But how quickly do we get there, and at what cost? If I were to say to a resident of Arlington, if someone said to me, what's the long-term trajectory of our taxes, I would say, well, yeah, if you go 30 years in the future, a resident here at that time will be paying the equivalent of those communities. We are going to be similar to them. That's the future of Arlington. But how do we get to that future? And I think that's a lot of times the discussion and the struggle that the Finance Committee has, which is, should we become aspirational all at once? Have a school committee, in order to pay for this $3.7 million increase, and they also ask for there's a growth factor that they get for each new student. They want it to go from 25 to 75%. To do that, they want a 20% property tax override in fiscal 18. And so you sit there and you say, wow, that's a big number, right? In order to continue, I should say 20% in order to keep the current funding of how we do, periodic overrides instead of overrides every single year. And you say, wow, that's a big number. And so that's a value. Is it worth, to jump to that next level of a more wealthy community all at once? Is it worth it to increase property tax 20%, knowing that will tip people? That will tip people who've been here a long time. Is that fair to them? Is that a community value? And I think a lot of ways that's, that's where the sort of the yin and the yang occurs between the school committee and the finance committee, where I think the school committee tends to be aspirational on the future of Arlington and their constituents who, like I said, were looking at this versus other wealthy communities. And the finance committee tends to look, I would say, more pragmatically. I'm sure they would have some, harsher words for us at things, and how do we balance this out for everyone?
Right, and that's an excellent segue to move into the second area of conversation I was wanting to address as well, which is how are these decisions being made? So you've already mentioned that there's a certain dynamic between the school committee and the finance committee. I'll ask either one of you if you could just lay out briefly for everybody, in general, who are the players as these decisions are being made, and what more or less is the role of each of those players in the process of deciding, whether to go to the voters for an override, at what point, whether to fund this, that, or the other thing, et cetera.
The budget construction process it really takes the full year to occur. We start looking at capital project requests in August. The capital planning committee starts meeting in September, so on and so forth. Budgets are constructed by the town manager and the superintendent of schools. And the town manager is responsible for gathering information from all the other appointing authorities and presenting a single balanced budget, including the amount of money that will come from the town to the schools, which is not the only funding that the schools have. They also have various grants and direct money coming from the state and the federal government, a small amount. That budget is then presented to the finance committee, which is a appointed board of 21 people, one from each precinct in the town, whose job is to compare those budget requests to projected income. That income's projected in the fall by, there's an internal committee, I think, that does the projections.
Yep.
That includes the treasurer and the assessor and various other town officials. And they compare those income projections to the budget. They're trying to make a guess about what the state is going to do or not do about our state aid. And that all comes together in a document that says this is how we're going to balance this. So everyone, including the schools, is free to ask for whatever amount of money they think they need to either continue to provide services or to add things that they see as needs that the people are demanding. But the rubber hits the road over the course of February and March when the Finance Committee looks in detail at those requests and says, this we can afford and that we can't. This is how we're going to get to balanced. That balanced budget is then presented to town meeting, and town meeting passes the budget. So town meeting is the legislative arm. They are the appropriations committee. They're the people who appropriate funds, not just in the budget, but in various other areas. They also pass a capital budget. And the capital budget is all the things that we're going to borrow money to do. And so the paying back of the borrowed money is a line in the operating budget, and that's how the capital budget fits into balance. And we tried to only carry a reasonable amount of debt so that we look good to the people who lend us that money so that our interest rate is low. Really, the school committee and the Board of Selectmen's only role in this is to set the priorities for the superintendent of schools and the town manager, who are the ones who are then saying, here's how we're going to carry out your goals and objectives, putting money against each of those goals and objectives. And the finance committee are the folks who then say, realistically, we can or we cannot do what you're asking us to do. So start telling us what your priorities are, because we're going to cut some of the things that you've said you think you need to do.
Yeah, and then piggybacking on Annie's point, one of the things I think when you talk to people around town who aren't involved in day-to-day government and they look at town government, I think it's this very confusing, confusing organism with elected people and appointed people, and elected people make decisions and appointed people do, and how does this work? How I try to break it down is I just go back to the structure of federal and state government, right, with your different branches. And I say, the selectmen in the school committee are members of the executive branch. They are elected executives. Like any executive branch, they don't have budgetary authority to pass budgets. The budgetary authority rests with town meeting, which is the town's legislature. And then because it would be a really disorganized process to have 240 people sit in a room and create a budget, the town's legislature has a subcommittee called the Finance Committee. And the Finance Committee's sole job is to recommend a budget to town meeting. And so what you see with the Finance Committee is they're all appointed members, including myself, with most also being town meeting members. I know we've tried over the years to make sure the members of the Finance Committee, when we can, are also town meeting members, so the person who's recommending to the legislature is in fact a member of the legislature, right? Because if you didn't have that, it would be awkward. And so that's the sort of general structure. And then you have, like Annie said, you have the capital planning committee underneath that, and you have some other, the executive branch actually appoints some of their own committees as well at town meeting. So that's the general structure. So that's how we end up with the different players in town. And it's not an inconsistent structure to any other town in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I think actually finance committees are a mandate from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We didn't create that by fiat or by our own wisdom.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And there's if you go on the town website and you look at the town bylaws and you look at a section of the town bylaws called the Town Manager Act, all of this is pretty much laid out there. The Finance Committee and its role and how it's appointed is defined there. Basically, the Finance Committee is appointed by the chair of the Finance Committee, the moderator, and the chair of the
Trust fund commissioners, I think.
trust fund commissioners. And the town has a lot of these little trust funds that are things people have left to. And so the person who's in charge of those trust funds is the tiebreaker, as it were.
Okay.
And the moderator is an elected position. So the appointments are made, have at least some input from an elected person who, could be recalled if you didn't like how he goes about.
Right, and the chair of the trust
appointing.
fund commissioners, I believe, is appointed by the selectmen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that is the other sort of body that you can go to and say, it's all your fault. We're not going to re-elect you. I think there's a couple of other committees that are really important to point out to people here, and that is that we formalized, when I was still on the Board of Selectmen, the idea that there should be a committee that meets regularly to look at our long-range planning, and that committee has on it the relevant town employees, superintendent of schools, her business manager, the town manager, the treasurer, I believe the deputy town manager sometimes attends because he actually does the nitty-gritty of the budget construction, and then several selectmen, 3 school committee members, and several members of the finance committee. And that committee really meets to look at what are our long-range financial prospects, and are there adjustments that we should make to this plan?
And I think when you say long range, we're talking about five
5
years out,
years.
up to 5 years out?
Yeah, 5 to 6 years. I think at this point we're actually projecting forward to 2022.
Yeah.
And part of that is that long-range plan has a bottom line, and somewhere that bottom line goes negative, and that's the year we're looking for, because that's our planning window for when do we have to go to the voters and say, we need to solve this problem one way or the other. And then there's a very public, similar committee called the Budget and Revenue Task Force that meets, in an evening and will actually take input from the public and so on and so forth. That is a similar combination of those powers.
Different stakeholders,
Yeah, those different stakeholders. That also meets regularly to receive a presentation on that financial plan, and those meetings are covered by your
By
ordinance, by ACMi, so that the public has some idea of what those long-range plans are looking like now and how they're impacting this year specifically, and what's the level of agreement amongst the various players about what we're going to do about it, and what are their questions that then are going to be answered later.
All right, that is a great synopsis between the two of you, a great outline of all of the different components of the decision-making process. Let's just talk briefly again, if possible, about, so what are we going to be expected to pay money for or need money for, how soon, and, not where does that come from, because it's going to come from
Right.
the homeowners' pockets in a sense.
Right.
But how is that going to be introduced? Is it part of the school committee's aspirational budget? Is it part of the town manager's budget, et cetera? So what are the most immediate costs that we can anticipate here?
Right. So I would say I'd break it, there are 4 buckets of spending, let's say, that we're going to have to do in the relatively near term. And what I mean by that is, let's say, 1 to 5 years. The first one I think that's going to come before the voters is the rebuild of Minuteman Vocational. I know on the prior your Arlington Dollar segment, you've talked about Minuteman, and you've said Arlington's share of that right now is probably going to be about $1.5 million. And so
Of the rebuild or the proposed rebuild?
of our share of the proposed rebuild will probably be about $1.5 million. I think they've settled on a $144 million school. You factor in various reimbursements and things like that, and allocate people's share, and we get down to about 1.5
1.5 total or 1.5?
per year. Sorry,
year
ours is going to be
for
$1.5 million per
I was
year.
going to say 1.5.
I know, wouldn't that be
doesn't
great?
sound too bad.
Yeah.
Right. So as I think if you start to benchmark that, right, I think one of the rules of thumbs that people have, and I always go back to when we voted on the Community Preservation Act last year. I think we talked about, it would be about $1.5 million a year in revenue to the town. It would cost about $75 on an average tax bill, right? So if you were to look at Minuteman, it's probably going to cost the average taxpayer per year for the next
About
30
seven.
years. It likely could be, if it's 1.5 million, about $75, right? It could be more, a little more, a little less, but it's going to be no more than 100 and no less than 50, let's say, right? So you give people a range.
Yeah, just to be clear though, I think it's 20 years, because I think if we do debt exclusion, we can only do a 20-year financing.
We can do 30 now.
We can do 30.
We can do 30
Oh,
now. We can
Lord.
stretch these things.
Okay.
We can stretch these things out. Which, by
Okay,
the
so we are talking, just to clarify, you're talking about that 1.5 million, which might be roughly $75 per household, going out 30 years for Minuteman
right. So what I
specifically.
so I think I should have started a different way. I think is average single-family tax bill in town is $7,500 right now. I looked it up. I think that was the FY16 certification that the assessor's office did. So take your $7,500, add $100 on top of that. Next in the pipeline would be, right behind that would be Arlington High School.
Right.
So that's always the wild card, right? Because there are 3 options you can have here. You can knock the thing down and rebuild a brand new high school. You could refurbish the existing building, or you could do a combination of the two. And the cost could range, right? It could be a $100 million refurbishment. It could be a $200 million rebuild. So I think a lot of times I've heard people talking consistently about $100 million share for the Arlington taxpayer that's going to have to finance. Again, we don't have the money for that. It's going to have to be through an override. Now, just to put this, think about it as a mortgage, right? So if you had a 30-year mortgage on $100 million, you pay interest and principal on that over that period of time. Let's say it comes out to $180 million of total debt service over that time. Do that, what you have to pay each year to amortize that debt. You probably have to pay about $6 million to amortize the debt. So in that situation, Arlington High is going to cost the average taxpayer no less than, I would say, $350, probably no more than $500 per year.
Per year.
Per year. Right, this isn't a cheap school. High schools are very, very expensive. And so take $7,500, add 100 on top of that, for Minuteman, you're at $7,600. Now let's say you had somewhere between, we'll round it off, 300 and 500 on top of that. So now you're talking about the average tax bill going up, somewhere between $7,900 and $8,182 $100. Now, if you look at the long range plan, we continue to be in a period where we're collecting, right now, where our expenses, our operating expenses, are growing faster than our income.
Right.
Okay? And so at some point, we're going to have an override. It's not a matter of if we're going to have an override, it's when we're going to have an override and what the scale of the override is going to be. And if you look at various scenarios that different people are looking at, we could have a 20% override in fiscal 18. We could have a 10% override in fiscal 2021. So now that's that big number out there, right? So now you're saying to yourself, okay, so somewhere between $750, using today's dollars, somewhere between $750 and $1,500 is going to be the override, right? So that, and I think that's a lot of times when you see these committees. And so that's the general layout. Well, the fourth thing I would say is we have, at this point, no structured plan on how we're going to deal with the facility side of the enrollment growth. Are we going to take back the Gibbs and put that online? Are we going to do these various scenarios? And when the school committee had released their space study back in September, which was based on the old McKibben numbers, they were looking at a scenario where it would cost no less than $20 million for these for these various things. And again, you got to, with those, that's a complicated issue because you have modules and how long can you bond them and things like that. But that's another cost that you're putting out there for the taxpayer. So that could be another $75 on top of it. So we're not talking about small money here.
Right.
So if things go in the way that you just outlined them, I think what you're saying, and of course I'm just roughly estimating, is that the average tax bill might well go over the next 5 to 8 years from $7,500 to much closer to $10,000.
It could. Yep. It's a very real possibility.
That's a very significant hit. We're talking about a 33, up to a third.
Yeah. At the last enrollment task force, I think they chair the capital planning committee, who spends a lot of time looking at things like this, tends to estimate 30 to 50% increase depending on the various scenarios and how we proceed as a government as a possibility.
Okay.
Right, and it's really important, I think, for the public to understand a couple of things about this, because we talk numbers like this without panicking. We kind of know what the implication of those numbers are and how we're going to work at coming to a reasonable number for all of this. But what I think people sometimes hear is this sort of fuzziness. And really what we're saying is that we are looking so far forward into the future, there are many options open to us, and we have brackets that we can give you. We can say the increases are going to start here or they're going to start later. The increase is going to be this much or it's going to be this much. It's somewhere in between the edges of those brackets, okay? The discussion that needs to be had is about what is between those brackets, and that discussion is a values discussion. What do we as a community value? And it's a services discussion. And that discussion is much harder to have than a discussion that's all cut and dried about numbers, okay? It would be really easy if all the citizens had to do was say, oh, well, here's what I agree to. I agree to $700. Make it work. But that doesn't really tell us, make it work how?
Okay.
Make it work by cutting what? Make it work by changing what? What is it that you value and don't value? And are you saying make it work because that's all you can afford, or are you saying make it work because that's all you want to invest?
Okay.
And so
Right, and I
those
think
are
one
the
of the-
questions we don't have the answers to.
And I think it's interesting because I think Annie just touched upon one of the large disagreements that goes on in town between the various boards and committee. And I'd go back 2 years ago, where year and a half ago, where anybody who knows me knows that I was passionately opposed to the adoption of the Community Preservation Act. And I sort of screamed from the high heavens that we should not do this. And the argument that I was making, which I think a lot of the members of the Finance Committee made, and I think we took a vote on this, is to say, we can't go through this process of chipping away at overrides. We can't go through, because at the time we were saying, guys, the Finance Committee was saying, a lot of people say, well, where did this creep up on us, this challenge? No, it didn't. I mean, that's nonsense. When you go back to 2014, the Finance Committee was strongly saying that Arlington High was on the table and needed to be rebuilt. Minuteman was on the table. We knew about enrollment growth and we were talking about it. We knew about the operating override. We actually, I'm not giving full disclosure, we missed that one. We actually said we thought it would be fiscal 18. It probably, if we don't have a large increase in spending for the schools, it would probably be about fiscal 20, fiscal 21. So we were talking about these, and our opinion at the time, or my opinion at the time, was that we need to put them all on the table and say to people, what do we want? What do we want as a community? Do we want, not that we can not do some of these things, but to what standard should we do these things? Should we go with like I said earlier on, should we go with the best of everything and increase taxes, 50%, 60% quickly, or should we maybe try to, be a little more conservative in our spending and let things go? And that was my argument back then when I said, I don't think the Community Preservation Act, the $75 is worth it. I think that we need to focus on other things like the schools and the enrollment and preserving the core services. And so I think that's a large yin and yang. Is there are some groups at town, primarily the Finance Committee, that looks at the cost over time, like Annie said, right? With maybe with regard to the qualitative aspects of it, but it's sometimes in more of a cold and calculating way. And then I think there's a total opposite perspective on town, which has no regard for the cost, or very little regard for the cost, and is looking aspirationally at what we could be. And so it's a very difficult conversation that we have.
Right, and you've just mentioned, the word again that you were talking about as well, which is necessary conversation to be had.
Right.
A conversation just like ours today requires that two or more sides or people listen to each other and have their voices heard as well. So how is it, and this will be a wrap up to our conversation today, how is it that you would urge and encourage Arlingtonians to get involved in this conversation and to make sure that you, as committee members, et cetera, are hearing back the answers to your questions? Where in that bracket should we go? What is it that we want to trade off this for that, or what are we willing to let go of or not, et cetera? What are the mechanisms? And from your guys' long experience now, what do you say to folks who, should or do have a stake in this about how it is that they can make their voices heard and contribute to the resolution of these questions?
So one of the difficulties we face, and I think what Dean was saying about the CPA feeds right into this difficulty, is that the public conversation tends to consist of voting on a tax issue. And so the CPA got voted in, and I voted for it, and I think it was a good idea, because I think otherwise there are things that we need to do that we're never going to set aside the money to do because of competing interests, and I think those are important things. But we did that vote in isolation, okay? The campaign around that vote doesn't consist of the whole conversation about what we see coming down the pike in the next 10 years, and that Dean is right about. We need our next set of conversations to be about that whole big picture, all right? And we need it to get us at what are the community values in some way. So I think there's a couple of things, practical things, that people should start considering. There are a bunch of town meeting precincts where town meeting members try to hold public meetings to discuss the warrant, all right? I think citizens should make the time to come to those meetings and meet their town meeting members. And if your town meeting delegation is not holding one of those meetings, maybe you look up who your town meeting member is and suggest to them that you'd be interested in helping them organize that meeting. I think the finance committee member from your precinct might want to show up at that meeting. So I think that's one way to start to have these conversations. Another way is just to get engaged with the town website and look at the information that's available there. The 5-year plan is laid out there, and you can see where we go right at the bottom line. Talk to your elected officials. There's already begun to be a series of public meetings to talk about the enrollment crisis in the schools. I think you need to come to those public meetings and get yourself engaged with that process. Or if nothing else, watch them on ACMi.
Some very concrete suggestions.
My take, and I'd go back to my own experience, and I tell people this story every now and then, and that is, 11 years ago, newly married 27-year-old childless Dean Carman joined the finance committee and got voted into town meeting and was going to change Arlington, right? We're going to take on the world, take on the government, fix all these problems. And after sort of flailing around for a month or so on the finance committee and sort of overreaching and not really having a direction, an older and more experienced finance committee member named Dan Dunn, who is now a selectman, pulled me aside and said, Dean, look, I understand you want to change everything, but that's not how government works. Government moves slowly, government moves methodically. So let me give you some advice, and this is, I always say, the best advice anyone ever gave me to approach town government. He said, pick one issue. Don't be the champion of everything. Don't be the champion of every single issue, the fire budget, the police budget, the school budget, the this, the that, because eventually you're going to get overwhelmed and people are going to stop listening to you, because when you get up and talk about every single issue passionately, you want, and you get droned out, right? So pick an issue. At the same time you're working on that issue, understand that it's not going to be resolved in 5 minutes. Just because Dean Carman walked in the room and said things should be done differently, people aren't going to just say, great, yeah, we're going to do that. It's going to be a process. Understand that you might not have success the first year. You might get voted down. Understand that the second year you might not have success. It might take time to get your issue. At the same time, I'll never forget him saying, he goes, understand the rest of government. Understand how town meeting works. Understand how Selectmen, learn about it. Just listen to it. Educate yourself. And that balance of focusing on one thing, whether you're a Thompson parent, focus on the Thompson. If you're a Thompson parent, I wouldn't say focus on the Thompson, the Audison, and Arlington High. You'll run yourself crazy going to meetings. You'll get burnt out. You'll get discouraged. You focus on that one issue. And then I always said the last thing he always said to me, and I'll always remember this, and he said, and remember the first year when you lose something, or when you lose in a debate, or you lose in an argument, you lost by someone who just disagreed with you. You did not lose to an enemy. These are your neighbors. Treat them like your neighbors. And I'll always remember that that sort of pep talk he gave me. And that's always guided a lot of my thinking, is Dan's approach to saying, this isn't personal. You're not going to take on and conquer everything all at once. You need to focus, but you need to understand the broader picture. So get involved in your one issue. Don't get involved in 10 issues. Champion it, fight it, be passionate about it. And then the last thing I would also say, just sort of adding to what he said about understanding, how everything works, is you got to understand the broader pictures. So if you're advocating for expansion at the Thompson or the Hardy, understand, you can't just say, this is my slice of the pie and this is all we care about. You've got to look and say, okay, how do we deal with the Audison? How do we deal with the high school? You got to keep in perspective, like I said, that there could be an outcome of massive tax increases that the voters might not want. Or maybe they want some of them. Worst case scenario would be, what if we got, we got a brand new $200 million Arlington High, but then the operating override failed. So you have a big building with no teachers in it.
Right.
So really, that would be my advice to people, is on an approach of how to get involved in government.
So I want-
champion your slice,
But understand
be
it all.
aware.
See the big picture.
the-
So I
of the
want to
bigger
add,
picture of
I
the
want to
pie.
add one quick thought
Last
to that.
thing.
Last quick thought, and that's this. Remember that everybody involved in this process has good intentions. Don't impugn the character of the people who disagree with you. And remember what James Baker said about how he successfully negotiated foreign policy issues with other governments. And that is that he started by trying to figure out what the other person's problem was and solve that. So that when you're standing up to advocate for the Thompson School, for example, and the Finance Committee says, what about all these other things? Don't say, those things don't matter, or you're putting too much emphasis on something else. Try to figure out the problem that they're getting at, and try to figure out what your answer to that problem is. How can you help them meet their objective as well as your own? And then you'll be listening to everybody involved, and not just hearing only yourself and only your argument and only your issue.
Well, that is a fitting close to the first of our new series of conversations this year for your Arlington Dollar. And we really do appreciate you guys taking the time and expounding on your experience and the wisdom you've acquired. I hope people are listening. I hope people respond, and I hope that all of us can participate in getting to a resolution around these various, serious challenges to come. So for Dean Carman, for Annie LaCourt, I'm James Milan. Thanks for joining us for this edition of Your Arlington Dollar, and we'll see you again soon.